The message came in so suddenly that for a moment I thought I had imagined it. "I need you to pull over right now and open the trunk." The words glowed cold and urgent on my phone screen, cutting through the blur of rain and city lights like a blade. My fingers tightened instinctively around the steering wheel as the windshield wipers swept back and forth in a frantic rhythm, barely keeping up with the drizzle that smeared the world into streaks of gold and red. I was already late, of course I was late. Tonight was Jessica's wedding, the grandest event my husband's family had ever hosted, and in their eyes I was once again failing them. I could already hear Sharon's voice in my head, sharp and venomous, accusing me of ruining everything simply by existing. To them, I was nothing more than a burden, a useless woman who clung to Ethan's success like a parasite. They never saw the truth, never cared to. In their world, Ethan was the self-made man, the brilliant CEO who had built an empire with his own hands, and I was just the poor, insignificant wife who didn't belong in their glittering circle. The phone rang earlier, and as expected, my mother-in-law's voice had torn into me without mercy, calling me lazy, cheap, and embarrassment. Then Ethan called, his tone even colder, warning me not to show up if I couldn't behave, reminding me yet again that everything I had, every dress, every meal, was paid for by him. I had swallowed it all, like I always did, letting the humiliation sink quietly into my chest where it had lived for 5 long years. But now this message from Maria, my assistant, the only person who knew the truth, felt different. There was urgency in it, a kind of silent alarm that made my heart begin to pound. Without thinking further, I flicked on my signal and pulled the car over to the side of the road, the tires crunching softly against wet gravel. The rain had softened into a mist, clinging to the air like a breath held too long. I turned off the engine and the sudden silence felt deafening after the chaos of traffic. For a second, I just sat there staring at the message again, my reflection faintly visible on the darkened screen, tired eyes, pale face, the picture of a woman who had long ago forgotten what it meant to fight back. Then I unbuckled my seatbelt with trembling hands and stepped out of the car. The cold air hit me immediately, sharp and grounding. But it did nothing to slow the wild beating of my heart. My heels clicked softly against the pavement as I walked toward the back of the car, each step heavier than the last, as if some invisible force was pulling me back, warning me not to continue. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. My hand hovered over the trunk release for just a moment before I pressed it. A soft mechanical click broke the silence, and the trunk slowly lifted open. What I saw inside made the world tilt beneath my feet. It wasn't empty. It wasn't ordinary. Sitting there, occupying the entire space, like a silent accusation, was a large black leather suitcase, expensive, familiar, unmistakable. My breath caught in my throat as recognition slammed into me. It was Ethan's suitcase, the one he always used for his overseas business trips, the one he had taken just days ago, claiming he had urgent meetings to attend. For a moment, my mind refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Why was it here? Why in my car? My hands began to shake as I reached forward and pulled it closer, the leather cold and damp beneath my fingers. The zipper wasn't locked. That, more than anything, sent a chill down my spine. Ethan was meticulous about his belongings. He never left anything unsecured, which meant whatever was inside, he hadn't planned for anyone to find it. A sense of dread washed over me, thick and suffocating. I hesitated, my fingers gripping the zipper but refusing to move. Somewhere deep inside, I knew that once I opened this suitcase, there would be no going back. The fragile illusion I had been living in for 5 years, the lies I had chosen to believe, would shatter completely. But the message echoed in my mind again: open the trunk. Slowly, with a breath that felt like it might be my last moment of peace, I pulled the zipper open. The sound was soft, almost insignificant, yet it echoed loudly in the silence around me. The lid lifted, and in that instant my entire world collapsed. At the very top, neatly arranged as if prepared for display, were velvet jewelry boxes, rich red against the dark interior. My heart stopped. My hands moved on their own, opening one of the boxes with a trembling motion. Inside, gleaming under the dim streetlight, was a blue diamond ring. My mother's ring, the heirloom that had been passed down through generations, the one Ethan had told me was stolen during a break-in a year ago. I remembered how I had cried, how I had clung to him as he comforted me, promising he would find the thief. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I forced myself to open the next box and the next. Each one revealed another piece of my past, my mother's necklace, her bracelet, treasures I thought were lost forever. My chest tightened painfully as the truth began to take shape, cruel and undeniable. Ethan hadn't lost them. He had taken them. He had lied to me. And this suitcase, this carefully hidden collection, was proof. But the nightmare didn't end there. Beneath the jewelry boxes was a folder, thick with documents. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out, flipping it open under the faint glow of the streetlight. Contracts, property deeds, legal papers. My name appeared again and again, but something was wrong. The signatures weren't mine. They looked perfect identical, but they weren't mine. They had been forged. My breath came in short. Shallow gasps as realization crashed over me. Ethan had been transferring my assets, my properties, my inheritance into someone else's name. And then I saw it. Printed clearly on the documents over and over again. Chloe Cole, his assistant. The same woman his mother always praised. The same woman I had once suspected only to be dismissed and humiliated for daring to question him. My hands shook so violently that the papers slipped slightly, revealing the final item hidden beneath them. 2 plane tickets, one way, business class, destination Zurich. Passenger names Ethan Reed. Chloe Cole. Departure time tonight. I stared at the tickets, my mind going completely blank. The sound of distant traffic faded into nothing. The cold air, the rain, the world itself seemed to disappear, leaving only the crushing weight of betrayal pressing down on me. For 5 years I had endured everything, every insult, every humiliation. Every moment of being treated as less than nothing because I believed in him. Because I thought I was protecting his pride, his dignity, his sense of self-worth. I had given up everything for him, and this was what he had been doing in return. Stealing from me, betraying me, planning to abandon me without a second thought. My grip tightened around the edge of the trunk as my knees threatened to give out. The tears that had once come so easily now stopped, completely replaced by something colder. Sharper. Something dangerous. Slowly, I closed the suitcase, the sound echoing like a final verdict. The woman who had stepped out of the car moments ago, the weak, silent wife who endured everything, was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. Someone who finally understood the truth. And as I looked down at the suitcase beside me, filled with evidence of everything he had done, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Tonight, nothing would go as Ethan planned. The rain had turned the city into a blurred painting of lights and shadows, every street lamp stretching into long golden streaks across the wet asphalt, as I drove toward the Plaza Hotel where Jessica's wedding was already in full swing. My grip on the steering wheel was tight, not just because of the slick roads, but because of the familiar knot forming in my chest. I was late again, and I could already imagine the humiliation waiting for me the moment I stepped into that ballroom. My mother-in-law's sharp voice, Jessica's mocking smile, Ethan's cold, disapproving stare. It would all play out exactly as it had so many times before. To them, I was nothing more than a burden, a woman who had married into their family without bringing anything of value, someone who existed only because Ethan allowed it. They never saw me as an equal, never once considered that I might have my own worth, my own story. And tonight, of all nights, they would make sure to remind me of that in front of every important guest they had invited. Just as I was trying to steady my thoughts, my phone buzzed sharply against the dashboard, the sudden sound making my heart jump. I glanced at the screen, expecting another call from Ethan or Sharon, another round of accusations and insults, but instead it was a message from Maria, my assistant, the only person who knew the truth about my life, the only one who had ever stood quietly on my side. The message was short, but every word felt heavy, urgent, almost suffocating. Pull over right now. Open your trunk. My breath caught instantly. Maria never sent messages like this without a reason. There was no greeting, no explanation, just a command. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong. A cold sensation spread through my chest as a wave of unease washed over me, making it hard to breathe. Without thinking any further, I flicked on my signal and guided the car toward the side of the road. The tires hissing softly against the wet surface as I came to a stop under a dim streetlight. The rain had softened into a fine mist, drifting through the air like a whisper, and for a moment the world around me felt unnaturally quiet. I turned off the engine and the sudden silence pressed in on me, amplifying the sound of my own heartbeat. My hands felt cold as I unbuckled my seatbelt, the small click echoing louder than it should have. For a second I just sat there, staring at the message again, as if hoping it would somehow change, as if there would be another explanation. But it didn't. The words remained the same, unwavering, demanding. Slowly, I pushed the car door open and stepped out into the damp night air. The chill hit my skin instantly, but it did nothing to calm the growing sense of dread tightening around my chest. My heels clicked against the pavement as I walked toward the back of the car, each step feeling heavier than the last. as though my body was resisting, as though some instinct deep inside me was warning me to stop. But I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't turn back. When I reached the trunk, my hand hovered over the release button for a brief moment. My fingers trembled slightly and I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. It's nothing, I told myself. It has to be nothing. But even as the thought formed, I knew it wasn't true. Taking a slow breath, I pressed the button. The trunk clicked open and lifted slowly, almost deliberately, as if revealing something it had been hiding for far too long. And then I saw it. A black leather suitcase. Large, expensive, familiar. My entire body went still. I knew that suitcase. I knew it instantly. It belonged to Ethan, the one he used for his business trips, the one he had taken just days ago when he told me he had to fly overseas for an important meeting. My mind struggled to make sense of it. Why was it here? Why in my car? A strange ringing filled my ears as my heart began to pound harder, faster, each beat echoing through my chest like a warning. Slowly, as if afraid it might disappear if I moved too quickly, I reached into the trunk and pulled the suitcase closer. The leather was cold under my fingers, slightly damp from the night air. It wasn't locked. That detail alone sent a sharp chill down my spine. Ethan never left anything unlocked. Never. Which meant he hadn't expected anyone to find it. My breath grew shallow as a terrible realization began to form, creeping into my thoughts like a shadow. Something was very wrong. My hands trembled as I reached for the zipper, hesitating for just a second. A part of me didn't want to open it. A part of me already knew that whatever was inside would change everything. But I couldn't stop now. I pulled the zipper slowly, the soft sound cutting through the silence like a blade. When I lifted the lid, my world shattered in an instant. Inside, arranged neatly at the top, were several red velvet jewelry boxes. My heart stopped. No, this couldn't be real. My hands moved before I could think, opening one of the boxes with shaking fingers. And there it was, my mother's blue diamond ring. The heirloom I had cried over for days when it had supposedly been stolen a year ago. The one Ethan had comforted me about, promising to find the thief. My vision blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I opened another box and another. Each one revealed something else. I had lost my mother's emerald necklace, her bracelet, pieces of my past that I had believed were gone forever. A suffocating pressure built in my chest as the truth slammed into me with brutal clarity. They hadn't been stolen. Ethan had taken them. He had lied to me. The man I had trusted, the man I had loved, had been the one who betrayed me all along. My hands shook uncontrollably as I pushed the jewelry boxes aside, revealing a stack of documents underneath. I pulled them out, my breath hitching as I scanned the pages. Contracts, property deeds, legal forms. My name appeared again and again, but something was wrong. The signatures weren't mine. They looked identical, perfect even, but they weren't mine. They had been forged. My heart pounded wildly as I flipped through the papers, each page revealing more of the same. My assets, my properties, everything I owned being transferred away without my knowledge. And then I saw the name, Chloe Cole. His assistant. The woman I had once suspected only to be dismissed, belittled, made to feel paranoid and foolish for even questioning him. My breath caught painfully in my throat as the final piece fell into place. My hands trembled as I reached deeper into the suitcase and pulled out the last item hidden beneath the documents. 2 plane tickets. One way. Business class. Destination, Zurich, Switzerland. Passenger names Ethan Reed and Chloe Cole. Departure time tonight. The world around me seemed to collapse into silence. I stared at the tickets, unable to move, unable to breathe. Tonight. He was planning to leave tonight. After Jessica's wedding. After everything. He was going to take my money, my family's legacy, my mother's heirlooms, and run away with her, leaving me behind to deal with whatever consequences followed. My knees felt weak as the full weight of his betrayal crashed over me. For 5 years I had endured everything, every insult. Every humiliation, every moment of being treated like I was nothing, because I believed in him. Because I thought I was protecting him. Because I loved him. And this was what he had been planning all along. I gripped the edge of the trunk tightly, forcing myself to stay upright as the pain twisted through my chest. But then slowly, something inside me shifted. The tears stopped. The shock faded. And in its place, something colder, sharper began to rise. I closed the suitcase with deliberate care, my hands steady now, my breathing calm. The woman who had stepped out of the car just minutes ago, the one who had been afraid, who had been willing to endure everything, was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. Someone who had finally seen the truth. I lifted my phone, my fingers no longer trembling, and stared at the screen for a moment before dialing Maria's number. My voice, when I spoke, was quiet, but it carried a weight it had never held before. "Get everything ready," I said. "Tonight, we end this." For 5 years, I had allowed the world to believe a carefully constructed lie, a lie so complete, so convincing, that even the man sleeping beside me every night never once questioned it. To everyone around us, Ethan Reed was the definition of success, a self-made CEO, a brilliant businessman who had clawed his way to the top through sheer determination and talent. His name carried weight in every room he entered, his confidence admired, his achievements envied. And standing quietly behind him, almost invisible in comparison, was me, Evelyn, the unremarkable wife who seemed to contribute nothing, the woman whispered about with thinly veiled contempt. They thought I was lucky to have married him. They thought I lived off his success, his money, his generosity. They thought I was nothing, and for 5 years I let them think that. I wore plain dresses instead of designer gowns, I kept my voice soft and my presence small. I endured every insult and humiliation without protest. Not because I lacked pride, but because I had made a choice born out of love, naive and blind. The truth was something none of them could have imagined. The empire Ethan proudly claimed as his own, the company he boasted about building from the ground up, had never belonged to him. It had always been mine. Hayes Industries was my inheritance, my legacy, the result of my father's lifetime of work. When he died, everything had fallen into my hands overnight. The company, the shares, the responsibility. I had been young, overwhelmed, grieving, and alone. And then Ethan appeared. He was attentive, gentle, seemingly sincere, in a way that felt like salvation during one of the darkest times of my life. He listened when I spoke, stayed when I cried, and made me believe that I didn't have to carry the weight of everything by myself. When our relationship became serious, when marriage was no longer just a distant thought, but a real possibility, he had taken my hands in his and looked at me with an expression so earnest, so vulnerable, that I never once doubted him. He told me he was afraid, not of responsibility, not of commitment, but of how others would see him. He didn't want to be known as the man who married into wealth, the one who rose to power because of his wife's fortune. His pride, he said, wouldn't allow it. He wanted to stand on his own, to prove himself, to earn respect, not as my husband but as a man in his own right. And because I loved him, because I believed in him, I agreed. It seemed like such a small sacrifice at the time. I would step back, remain in the shadows while he became the face of the company. Officially, he would be the CEO, the leader, the visionary. Unofficially, nothing would change. I would still hold the majority shares, still make the final decisions behind the scenes, still ensure everything ran smoothly through Maria, my most trusted assistant. It was supposed to be a partnership, built on trust and mutual respect. I never imagined it would become the foundation of my own undoing. The transition had been seamless. Legal documents were adjusted, roles reassigned, appearances carefully managed. To the outside world, Ethan Reed rose rapidly through the ranks, a rising star who quickly took control of a thriving corporation. Investors admired him, employees respected him, and his family worshipped him. Meanwhile, I disappeared quietly from the spotlight, allowing myself to be reduced to a background figure in my own story. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Love was more important than recognition. His happiness was my happiness. His success, even if built on my foundation, was something I could be proud of. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. The man who had once spoken to me with warmth and gratitude started to speak with authority, then with impatience, then with condescension. The line between pretense and reality blurred, and somewhere along the way, Ethan stopped pretending altogether. He no longer acted like a man borrowing power, he acted like a man who truly believed it belonged to him. And the rest of the world reinforced that belief every single day. His mother praised him endlessly, calling him a genius, a provider, the pillar of the family. His sister idolized him, boasting about his wealth and status. Their admiration fed his ego, strengthened his illusion, until it became something unshakable. And me, I became invisible. Worse than invisible, I became expendable. The more I shrank myself to preserve his pride, the more he took that as proof that I had none. The more I stayed silent, the more he assumed I had nothing worth saying. It never once occurred to him that the power he wielded so carelessly had been placed in his hands by me. That every luxury he enjoyed, every success he claimed, every ounce of respect he received, had been built on something that was never his to begin with. Even when he began treating me like a burden, even when his words grew cold and his actions careless, I held on to the belief that somewhere beneath it all, the man I had fallen in love with still existed. I told myself he was just under pressure, that success had changed him, that things would get better if I just waited. I was wrong. The truth, when it finally revealed itself, was far more brutal than I could have imagined. Standing there on the side of the road, the suitcase still fresh in my memory, the evidence of his betrayal sitting heavy in my mind, everything suddenly became clear. The lies, the manipulation, the arrogance. It had all been built on the assumption that I would never step out of the shadows, that I would never reclaim what was mine, that I would continue to protect his illusion, even as it destroyed me. A slow, bitter smile formed on my lips as realization settled into place. For 5 years, I had been playing the role of the weak, dependent wife. I had allowed them to believe I was nothing, and now that lie was about to shatter, because the truth was no longer something I was willing to hide. I wasn't the woman living off Ethan Reed. I was the woman who had given him everything and the only one who had the power to take it all away. 5 years earlier, before the lies, before the humiliation, before the slow, suffocating erosion of everything I once believed in, there had been a version of me who still trusted love without question. Back then, I was not the silent, subdued woman people saw now. I was Evelyn Hayes, the sole heir to a vast corporate empire, the majority shareholder of Hayes Industries, a name that carried influence across boardrooms and industries alike. But that identity had come to me not as a blessing, but as a burden. My father's sudden death had left me alone at the top of a world I wasn't ready to lead. The grief was overwhelming, heavy and relentless, pressing down on me in ways I could barely endure. Every decision felt like a test. I was destined to fail every meeting, a performance I wasn't prepared to give. The people around me, executives, investors, board members, spoke to me with respect, but behind their eyes I could see doubt. I was too young, too inexperienced, too fragile. And in the midst of all that pressure, all that loneliness, Ethan appeared like a lifeline. He wasn't extraordinary in status or position, just a mid-level manager in one of our departments, but he had something no one else offered me at the time: warmth. He spoke gently, listened patiently, and never once looked at me like I was a responsibility or a liability. Instead, he looked at me like I was simply a woman, someone worth caring for, not someone who needed to prove herself. It was disarming. Comforting in a way I didn't realize I had been craving. He would bring me coffee when I stayed late at the office, sit with me in silence when I couldn't find the strength to speak, and offer quiet reassurance when everything felt like it was falling apart. Slowly, almost without noticing, I began to rely on him. He became the one person I could breathe around, the one presence that made the chaos of my life feel manageable. And when he confessed his feelings to me, it felt natural, inevitable. I fell for him not because he was powerful, but because he made me feel safe. Our relationship grew quickly, built on what I believed was sincerity and mutual understanding. For the first time since my father's death, I allowed myself to imagine a future that wasn't defined by responsibility alone. A future where I didn't have to carry everything by myself. But as our relationship deepened and talk of marriage began to surface, Ethan's demeanor changed in subtle but significant ways. One evening during a quiet dinner, he reached across the table and held my hand, his expression serious in a way I hadn't seen before. He told me he loved me, that he wanted to spend his life with me, but there was something troubling him. He spoke about his family, about his mother who had worked tirelessly to raise him and his sister, about their modest background and the values they held. He told me that if they found out he was marrying the heiress to a massive corporation, everything would change. They would feel inferior, distant. People would assume he was using me, that his achievements were not his own. And as a man, he said he couldn't bear that. He didn't want to live under the shadow of my wealth. He wanted to stand beside me as an equal, not behind me as someone defined by my success. His words were filled with vulnerability, with a quiet desperation that tugged at my heart. At the time, they felt sincere, honorable even. I admired his pride. His desire to prove himself, his unwillingness to rely on someone else's power. I saw it as strength, not insecurity. And when he asked me if we could keep my identity hidden, if we could present a different version of our story to the world, I didn't hesitate for long. It seemed like a small compromise for the sake of love. I convinced myself that what we had was real enough to withstand a little secrecy. So I agreed. I agreed to step out of the spotlight and let him take my place. I agreed to let the world believe that he was the one who had built everything, that he was the successful provider, and I was simply his wife. I agreed to shrink myself so he could stand taller. At first, it didn't feel like a loss. I still had control behind the scenes. Through Maria, my most trusted assistant, I continued to oversee the company's operations, approve major decisions, and ensure everything ran as it should. On paper, nothing had changed. But in reality, everything had. I withdrew from public appearances, avoided industry events, and distanced myself from the identity I had once carried so confidently. I traded tailored suits for simple dresses, boardroom discussions for quiet evenings at home. And Ethan, he stepped into his new role with enthusiasm. He worked hard, yes, but he also embraced the recognition, the admiration, the power that came with being seen as the man at the top. I told myself I was proud of him. That his success, even if built on my foundation, was something we shared. Our marriage began like a dream. In private, he was still attentive, still kind, still the man I had fallen in love with. He would thank me, reassure me, remind me that everything he was doing was for us, for our future. And I believed him. I believed every word. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance between us began to shift. The gratitude faded. The warmth cooled. The respect I thought we shared started to disappear, replaced by something else, something colder, more distant. The line between the role he was playing and the reality he was living blurred, and over time he stopped seeing himself as someone borrowing power. He began to believe it was his. And because I had given up my voice, my presence, my identity, there was nothing to challenge that belief. I had created a world where his illusion could thrive, where his pride could grow unchecked. And in doing so, I had unknowingly set the stage for my own suffering. Looking back, I realized how naive I had been. I thought love meant sacrifice. I thought protecting his pride meant diminishing my own. I thought that if I gave enough, if I endured enough, things would remain the way they were in the beginning. But love built on imbalance, on secrecy, on one person shrinking so the other can expand, it doesn't stay pure. It warps. It distorts. It turns into something unrecognizable. And by the time I understood that it was already too late, the woman I had been 5 years ago would never have imagined the reality I was living now. She would have believed in Ethan until the very end. She would have trusted him, defended him, protected him. But that woman no longer existed. All that remained was the truth, harsh, undeniable, and long overdue. And that truth was simple: everything Ethan had become, everything he had claimed, everything he had built his identity upon, had only been possible because I had allowed it. For 5 long years, I lived in a house that was legally mine, financially mine, every inch of it, bought with my own money, yet I was treated as if I were an unwanted guest who had overstayed her welcome. To the outside world, it was Ethan's home, a symbol of his success and generosity, a place he had supposedly provided for his family through hard work and brilliance. And because I had allowed that illusion to exist, his family believed it without question. The moment my mother-in-law, Sharon, stepped through the doors of that house, everything changed. She didn't see a daughter-in-law. She saw a freeloader, a woman she believed had trapped her successful son and was now living comfortably off his achievements. From the very beginning, her words were sharp-cutting, filled with a contempt that never softened no matter how quietly I endured it. She would criticize the way I dressed, calling my clothes cheap and tasteless, unaware that I had deliberately chosen simplicity over luxury to maintain the lie. She would scoff at the way I spoke, saying I lacked education, lacked refinement, lacked worth. Every small mistake, real or imagined, became an excuse for her to humiliate me, often in front of others, as if my degradation was something she took pride in. And Jessica, my sister-in-law, was no different. If anything, she was worse in her own way, more subtle, more manipulative. She treated me like a servant, borrowing my belongings without permission, taking my handbags, my shoes, even small pieces of jewelry, and never returning them. When I dared to question her even gently, she would immediately twist the situation, running to Sharon with tears in her eyes, painting herself as the victim. And Sharon, without fail, would take her side, turning on me with even greater hostility. Everything in this house belongs to my son, she would say, her voice dripping with disdain. Jessica has every right to take what she wants. Who do you think you are to object? Those words echoed in my mind countless times, each repetition driving the truth deeper into me, not their truth but mine. The house belonged to me. The money they spent so freely, the lifestyle they flaunted so proudly, it was all mine. And yet I said nothing. I endured it all in silence, convincing myself that this was the price I had chosen to pay. Even Ethan, the man I had once believed would protect me, became part of that cruelty. At first, his dismissiveness was subtle. When I confided in him about his mother's harsh treatment, he would brush it off, telling me I was being too sensitive, that I should be more understanding, that she was simply old-fashioned. But over time, his tone changed. What had once been mild dismissal turned into irritation, then into outright indifference. He began to speak to me the same way his family did, with impatience, with superiority, with an underlying belief that I owed him everything. "You don't do anything all day," he would say, his voice cold and dismissive. "The least you can do is take care of the house and respect my mother." Those words cut deeper than anything Sharon had ever said, because they came from the one person I had sacrificed everything for. He truly believed it. He believed I was useless, that I contributed nothing, that I lived off him, and the more he believed it, the more he treated me like it was true. I remember one morning vividly, the kind of memory that lingers sharp and unrelenting. I had woken up feeling ill, my body weak, my head heavy with fever. I asked the housekeeper for something simple, just a bowl of warm porridge. Before she could even respond, Sharon stormed into the kitchen, her expression twisted with anger. She slammed a pot into the sink and began shouting, accusing the housekeeper of wasting resources on someone like me. Then she turned to me, her eyes filled with pure contempt. "You think you deserve to be taken care of?" she snapped. "My son works day and night to support this family, and you just lie around doing nothing. Get up. If you have the energy to eat, you have the energy to work." She ordered me to wash Ethan's shirts by hand, refusing to let me use the washing machine because, in her words, I wasn't worthy of handling anything expensive. I was sick, trembling, barely able to stand, but I did it. I stood there for hours, my hands submerged in cold water, my body aching, my vision blurring, tears slipping silently down my face. And that night, when I told Ethan what had happened, just hoping that he would show even a hint of concern, he looked at me with annoyance. "Why are you making such a big deal out of this?" he said. "It's just housework. My mom is right, you should do something useful instead of complaining all the time." That was the moment something inside me cracked. Though I didn't fully realize it then, it wasn't just the cruelty. It was the complete lack of recognition, the absolute certainty with which they dismissed my existence. Meanwhile, they continued to enjoy everything I had provided. Jessica's endless shopping sprees funded by money she believed came from her brother's success. Sharon's expensive jewelry and lavish lifestyle worn proudly as proof of her son's achievements. Even the grand wedding they were preparing for every detail. Every extravagant expense was paid for with money that ultimately came from me. They lived in luxury, surrounded by comfort and excess, all built on a foundation they never once questioned. And I stood at the center of it all, invisible, unheard, unacknowledged. I had given up my identity for love, believing it would strengthen our bond, believing it would create a life where we stood as equals. Instead, it created a world where I was diminished, where my silence became permission, where my sacrifices were mistaken for weakness. Day after day, insult after insult, I swallowed everything, telling myself it would be worth it, that things would change, that the man I had loved would remember who I was to him. But he never did. Instead, he grew more distant, more arrogant, more convinced of his own superiority. And his family followed suit, their cruelty escalating as their confidence grew. They thought they knew their place in the world at the top, supported by Ethan's success. They thought I knew mine beneath them, dependent, insignificant. And for 5 years I let them believe that. But what they didn't understand, what they never even considered, was that the very foundation they stood on belonged to me. And when that truth finally came to light, everything they had built their pride upon would collapse just as easily as it had been created. The truth did not come to me all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a carefully hidden wound being forced open layer by layer, each revelation more painful than the last. It began with something small, almost insignificant. A series of financial reports Maria had quietly placed in front of me during one of our routine secret meetings. At first glance, everything appeared normal. The numbers were solid, the growth steady, the projections promising. To anyone else, it would have looked like a thriving company under capable leadership. But Maria was not just anyone. She had worked alongside my father for decades, had helped build the company from its earliest days, and she knew every detail of its operations with an almost instinctive precision. When she pointed out certain transactions, highlighted lines buried deep within the reports, I felt a flicker of unease. The amounts were unusually large, far beyond what would be considered reasonable for the projects they were supposedly funding. Raw materials procurement, marketing expansions, new branch developments. All legitimate on the surface, yet something about the frequency and scale didn't add up. At first, I wanted to believe it was just aggressive business strategy, perhaps even Ethan trying to prove himself by pushing the company forward at a faster pace. But Maria's expression told me otherwise. There was no confidence in her eyes. No reassurance, only concern. Quiet, controlled, but unmistakable. She had already begun digging deeper before bringing the issue to me, and what she found shattered the fragile trust I had been clinging to. The companies receiving these massive payments were nothing more than empty shells, entities that existed only on paper, with no real operations, no employees, no physical presence. They had been created for a single purpose: to siphon money out of my company. And the name tied to their ownership was not Ethan's directly, but it was close enough to make my blood run cold. A foreign national officially listed as the owner was in fact connected to Chloe Cole, Ethan's personal assistant. The same woman who had steadily risen through the ranks with suspicious speed, the same woman whose presence had always lingered just a little too close to my husband's orbit. My first instinct was denial. I clung to it desperately, grasping for any explanation that could absolve him. Maybe he had been deceived. Maybe Chloe had manipulated things behind his back. Maybe he didn't know. I remember looking at Maria, my voice trembling as I tried to piece together a version of reality that didn't involve betrayal. But Maria didn't argue with me. She didn't try to convince me with words. Instead, she handed me a tablet and pressed play. The video that appeared on the screen destroyed every illusion I had left. It was dark, filled with smoke and noise, the atmosphere thick with something dangerous and illicit. At the center of it all, sitting confidently at a table, surrounded by piles of chips and cards, was Ethan. There was no hesitation in his movements, no uncertainty in his expression. He wasn't a victim. He wasn't confused or out of place. He belonged there. His eyes were sharp, almost feverish, his smile wide and reckless as he laughed loudly, his arm wrapped around a woman who was certainly not me. The image was so clear, so undeniable that for a moment I couldn't breathe. This wasn't the man I thought I knew. This wasn't the careful, composed CEO who spoke about discipline and hard work. This was someone else entirely, someone driven by greed, by thrill, by a hunger that I had never seen before. Maria's voice was calm as she explained what I was looking at. An illegal high-stakes casino operated by powerful figures who did not tolerate losses or debts lightly. Ethan had been going there regularly, using company funds, my company's funds, to fuel his addiction. And he wasn't just playing casually. He was losing. Losing more than I could have imagined. The embezzled money, the shell companies, the questionable transactions, it all led here. Every dollar that had disappeared had been funneled into that dark, dangerous world. My hands trembled as I held the tablet, but the worst was yet to come. Maria handed me another document, and as I looked down at it, the numbers blurred together at first. It took a moment for my mind to process what I was seeing. A promissory note. A debt. Not a small one, not something manageable or explainable. Millions. Tens of millions. The kind of debt that didn't just ruin a person, it destroyed them. And it wasn't owed to a bank or a legitimate institution. It was owed to a loan shark, someone connected to the very same underground network as the casino. The repayment deadline was looming. The interest piling up at a rate that made escape nearly impossible. And the consequences of failure were unthinkable. My body went cold as the reality settled in. Ethan wasn't just irresponsible. He wasn't just reckless. He was trapped. Completely, hopelessly trapped. But instead of facing the consequences, instead of coming to me, instead of trusting the person who had given him everything, he had chosen another path. The final piece of the truth came not from Maria's investigation, but from something much closer to home. Receipts, contracts, payments tied to Jessica's upcoming wedding. At first, they seemed unrelated, just part of the extravagant preparations my mother-in-law had been boasting about for months. But when I traced the source of the funds, the pattern became clear. The wedding, the lavish venue, the designer dress, the luxurious catering had all been paid for using the same siphoned money, the same stolen funds. It wasn't just a celebration, it was a facade. A final display of wealth and success designed to maintain the illusion Ethan had built, even as everything beneath it was collapsing. And then there was Chloe. Her involvement was no longer subtle, no longer something I could dismiss or ignore. The financial ties, the shell companies, the connection to the debt, it all pointed to her being more than just an assistant. She was part of it, part of his plan, part of his escape. The messages I had once glimpsed on his phone, the late nights he had explained away the defensiveness whenever I questioned him, it all made sense now. The affair wasn't just emotional. It was strategic. Together they had built a plan to take everything they could and disappear before the consequences caught up to them. By the time I left that meeting with Maria, I was no longer the same person who had walked in. The love I had once felt for Ethan didn't shatter dramatically, it faded piece by piece. Until there was nothing left but a hollow understanding. Every kindness he had shown me in the past now felt like part of a performance. Every promise, every reassurance, every moment of tenderness, all of it was overshadowed by the reality of who he had become. Or perhaps who he had always been. The man I loved had never truly existed. And the man in his place was not just a liar, but a thief, a gambler, and a traitor who had been willing to sacrifice everything, including me, to save himself. The truth was no longer something I could ignore or hide from. It was clear, undeniable, and it changed everything. Everything began to connect in a way that was both terrifying and painfully clear, like scattered pieces of a puzzle finally locking into place to reveal a picture I never wanted to see. The lavish wedding preparations that had once seemed excessive, even absurd, now took on a completely different meaning. For months, Jessica had proudly flaunted every detail: the designer gown, encrusted with crystals, the five-star hotel ballroom, the imported flowers. The gourmet catering meant to impress hundreds of elite guests. Sharon had boasted endlessly about her son's success, about how Ethan was sparing no expense to give his beloved sister the wedding of her dreams. And I had stood there silent, listening to their praise, watching them celebrate a generosity they believed came from him. But now I knew the truth. Every dollar spent on that extravagant display had been stolen. It was my company's money, my father's legacy, being drained and repurposed to build a facade of wealth and success that didn't belong to him. The realization made my chest tighten, not just from anger, but from a deeper, more bitter understanding. This wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was a performance. A final act in a carefully orchestrated illusion. The timing of everything suddenly made perfect sense. The mounting debts, the desperate embezzlement, the hidden shell companies, it had all been leading up to this moment. Ethan wasn't trying to save the company. He wasn't even trying to maintain it. He was preparing to abandon it. The wedding was his last chance to present himself as the powerful, successful CEO in front of his family, his business partners, and the world. A grand, unforgettable spectacle that would cement his image before he disappeared. And while everyone was distracted by the celebration, by the music and the laughter and the illusion of happiness, he would slip away quietly, taking everything he could with him. The plane tickets in the suitcase were no longer just evidence of betrayal, they were proof of his escape plan. Zurich. A one-way flight. No intention of coming back. And he wouldn't be leaving alone. Chloe's name printed beside his, on those tickets, burned into my mind. A constant reminder that this wasn't just about money or desperation, it was betrayal in its most personal form. He hadn't just chosen to run. He had chosen to run with her, to build a new life somewhere far away, free from consequences, free from responsibility, leaving me behind to deal with the aftermath of everything he had done. The debts, the legal consequences, the collapse of the company's reputation, all of it would fall on me. In his mind, I would be the perfect scapegoat. The useless wife who knew nothing, who had no power, no influence, no voice. The one person no one would suspect had been controlling everything all along. The more I thought about it, the more I realized just how meticulously he had planned it. Every move, every lie, every transaction had been calculated. He had hidden his gambling addiction behind long work hours, masked his financial crimes under the guise of business expansion, and used the trust I had placed in him as a shield against suspicion. Even the wedding itself had been part of the plan, not out of love for his sister, but as a strategic distraction, a glittering cover for his final act of betrayal. And perhaps the most painful part of it all was the realization that I had helped make it possible. By hiding my identity, by stepping back, by allowing him to take control, I had given him the perfect opportunity to do exactly what he had done. I had created a world where he could play the role of a powerful man without ever being questioned, where his actions went unchecked because no one believed there was anyone above him. He hadn't just taken advantage of the situation, he had exploited it completely. The thought made something inside me shift, something cold and sharp, replacing the lingering traces of hurt. For so long I had endured everything in silence, believing that patience and sacrifice would eventually be rewarded. But now, standing in the aftermath of his deception, I saw the truth for what it was. There was no misunderstanding, no justification, no excuse. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice, a calculated betrayal that spanned years, built on lies layered so carefully that they had almost become reality. Almost, but not anymore. Because now I knew everything, and once the truth is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. The wedding, the money, the escape plan, it all pointed to the same conclusion. Ethan wasn't just planning to leave, he was planning to erase me, to take everything that belonged to me and walk away as if I had never existed. But what he failed to realize was that the very thing he had relied on, my silence, my invisibility, was no longer something he could count on. The illusion he had built was fragile, dependent on a truth he thought would never be revealed. And now that truth was in my hands, undeniable and complete. The grand wedding he had orchestrated, the perfect stage he had prepared for his final performance, was about to become something entirely different. Not a celebration of success, but the beginning of his downfall. Because while he had been planning his escape, I had been uncovering the truth. And tonight, every piece would finally come together. By the time I stepped back into the car, the trembling had stopped completely. The shock, the disbelief, even the lingering pain, they had all settled into something far more dangerous: clarity. For the first time in 5 years, my thoughts were no longer clouded by love, by hesitation, by the desperate need to hold on to something that had already rotted beyond repair. Everything was sharp, precise, and undeniable. Ethan's betrayal was not impulsive. It was calculated, layered, and long in the making. And if he had spent years preparing to destroy me, then I would take these next few hours to ensure he never recovered from it. I picked up my phone and dialed Maria without a second thought. She answered immediately, as if she had been waiting for this moment. "Miss Hayes," she said, her voice steady, professional, but laced with a quiet urgency. I didn't waste time. "Initiate everything," I replied, my tone calm, almost eerily so. "We move tonight." There was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation but acknowledgement. Maria understood exactly what that meant. For years, she had stood in the background with me, silently maintaining the truth while the world believed a lie. Now it was time to bring everything into the open. "Understood," she said. "All teams are on standby. Legal, finance, internal security, they're ready for your signal." I glanced at the black suitcase beside me, the weight of its contents no longer crushing, but empowering. "Good," I continued. "First, freeze every account tied to Ethan. Personal, corporate, shell companies, everything. I don't want him to have access to a single dollar." Maria didn't question it. "It will be done within minutes." Next, I said, my eyes fixed on the road ahead as I started the engine again. "Prepare the full evidence package. The forged documents, the transfer records, the casino footage, the loan shark debt, everything. I want it organized, verified, and ready to present." My voice remained steady, but beneath it was a growing intensity, a controlled fire that refused to be extinguished. This was no longer about reacting. This was about execution. Maria responded immediately, her efficiency unwavering. "The files are already compiled. Our legal team has notarized copies and digital backups are secured. We can project everything if needed." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched my lips. Of course she had. Maria had always been one step ahead, anticipating what I might need before I even asked for it. "Perfect," I said softly. "Bring the lawyers to the hotel. Have them wait outside the ballroom until I give the signal." There was another brief pause, and this time her voice lowered slightly. "Are you going in alone?" I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror for a moment. My face was calm, composed, almost unrecognizable compared to the woman who had been crying just hours before. "Yes," I answered. "They need to see me first. The same woman they've always looked down on. The same one they think they can control." I tightened my grip on the steering wheel as the city lights blurred past me. Let them believe that for a few more minutes. Maria didn't argue. She understood the strategy, the psychological weight of what was about to happen. "Understood," she said. "What about law enforcement?" "Contact them," I replied without hesitation. "Provide everything. Request immediate presence at the hotel. I want them ready to move the moment the evidence is revealed." This time Maria's tone carried a hint of satisfaction. "It will be arranged. They'll be in position." I ended the call and exhaled slowly, feeling the final pieces of the plan fall into place. Every step was deliberate, every move calculated. There was no room for error, no space for doubt. Ethan had built his illusion carefully, brick by brick, lie by lie. Tonight, I would tear it down just as methodically. As I approached the hotel, its towering structure came into view, illuminated by golden lights that reflected off the rain-slicked pavement. It looked magnificent, grand, elegant, the perfect setting for a celebration. But beneath that polished exterior was a stage waiting for its truth to be revealed. I parked in the VIP section, stepping out into the cool night air with a sense of calm that felt almost surreal. The faint sound of music drifted from inside, laughter and applause echoing through the entrance as guests continued to celebrate, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. In their eyes, tonight was a night of joy, of prestige, of admiration for Ethan Reed, the successful CEO, the generous brother, the man who had supposedly made it all possible. They had no idea that the very foundation of that image was about to collapse beneath their feet. I reached into the back seat and pulled the suitcase out, gripping its handle firmly. It no longer felt like a burden. It felt like evidence. Like a weapon. As I walked toward the entrance, my steps were steady, measured, each one bringing me closer to the moment I had unknowingly been preparing for all these years. The humiliation, the silence, the endurance, it had all led here. And for once, I wasn't afraid of what waited on the other side of those doors. I welcomed it. Because tonight, I wouldn't be the woman who bowed her head and endured. Tonight, I would be the one who spoke, the one who revealed, the one who ended it all. And as the grand doors of the ballroom came into view, I knew with absolute certainty that there was no turning back. The war had already begun. The moment the final piece of evidence flashed across the giant screen, the entire ballroom seemed to fall into a stunned, suffocating silence. The laughter, the music, the clinking of glasses, all of it vanished as if it had never existed. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on the projection, on the undeniable truth laid bare in front of them. The forged documents, the stolen assets, the casino footage, the transfer records showing millions siphoned away, and finally, the plane tickets to Switzerland with Ethan and Chloe's names printed clearly for all to see. The illusion shattered in real time, collapsing under the weight of its own deception. I stood at the center of it all, calm and unmoving, while chaos erupted around me. Jessica's trembling hands clutched the wedding gift box as the loan shark's demand letter slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor. Her face, once glowing with happiness, twisted into disbelief and horror. This isn't real," she whispered, her voice cracking as tears began to stream down her face. But no one answered her. No one could, because the truth was no longer something that could be denied. Sharon staggered backward, her gold-laden hands shaking violently as she stared at the screen, then at her son, then back at me. "Ethan! Tell them this is a lie," she demanded, her voice rising into a desperate shriek. "Tell them this woman is making it all up," but Ethan didn't speak. He couldn't. The man who had once commanded rooms with confidence now looked like a shadow of himself, his face drained of color, his body trembling as if the weight of everything had finally crushed him. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape that no longer existed. The guests, his business partners, his investors, the people who had once admired and respected him began to murmur among themselves, their expressions shifting from admiration to suspicion, then to disgust. The foundation of his carefully constructed image was gone, replaced by something far uglier. I stepped forward slowly, the sound of my heels echoing softly against the marble floor, drawing every gaze toward me. For the first time in 5 years, I wasn't shrinking, wasn't hiding. I reached for the microphone, my fingers steady as I lifted it. "Good evening," I said, my voice clear, calm, and unwavering as it carried through the silent room. "I believe it's time everyone here learns the truth." A ripple of tension spread through the crowd, every word pulling them deeper into the moment. I turned slightly, my gaze settling on Ethan, who now looked as though he could barely stand. "For those of you who don't know me," I continued, "my name is Evelyn Hayes. And I am the majority shareholder, the true owner of the company you all believe belongs to Ethan Reed." The words hit the room like a shockwave. Gasps erupted, whispers intensified, and disbelief spread like wildfire. The image on the screen shifted, revealing official shareholder documents, my name displayed clearly, undeniably. There was no room left for doubt. Everything they believed about him had been built on a lie. Ethan shook his head weakly, his lips parting as if to protest, but no words came out. His power, his authority, his identity, it had all been stripped away in a matter of minutes. For 5 years, I continued, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling around me. I allowed this man to stand in my place. I gave him everything, my company, my trust, my name, and in return he used that trust to betray me. I gestured toward the screen where the footage of him gambling played once more, his laughter echoing faintly through the speakers. He embezzled millions from the company, used shell corporations to cover his tracks, funded this entire wedding with stolen money, and planned to flee the country tonight with his accomplice, leaving me and all of you to deal with the consequences. At the mention of Chloe, all eyes turned toward the back of the room where she stood frozen, her face pale as death. She tried to step away to disappear into the crowd, but it was too late. The doors of the ballroom burst open with a force that made several guests flinch. The sharp sound of boots against the floor cut through the silence as uniformed officers entered their presence, commanding immediate attention. The captain stepped forward, his voice firm and authoritative. Ethan Reed and Chloe Cole, he announced, you are under arrest for corporate embezzlement, fraud, and document forgery. The words echoed through the room, final and irreversible. Chloe let out a shrill scream, her composure shattering completely as she struggled against the officers who moved swiftly to restrain her. I didn't do anything, she cried, her voice hysterical. Ethan made me do it, it was all his idea. Her betrayal came as quickly as her loyalty had once been given, her desperation laid bare for everyone to see. Ethan, however, didn't resist. He didn't even try. His knees buckled beneath him, and he collapsed onto the floor, the last remnants of his dignity crumbling as he looked up at me with hollow, desperate eyes. Evelyn. Please, he whispered, his voice broken, unrecognizable. I was wrong. I made a mistake. Just help me this once. We can fix this. I looked down at him. The man I had once loved and felt nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no lingering attachment. Only a cold, distant clarity. You made your choices, I said quietly, my voice cutting through his pleas with absolute finality. Now you'll face the consequences. The officers pulled him to his feet, securing the handcuffs around his wrists as he struggled weakly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. Around us, the fallout continued to unfold. Jessica collapsed onto the stage, her wedding dress pooling around her as she sobbed uncontrollably, her dream of a perfect life disintegrating in front of everyone. Her fiancé's family stood stiffly, their faces filled with disgust and outrage. Without a word, they turned and walked out, abandoning the ceremony and her without hesitation. The message was clear. The marriage was over before it had even truly begun. Sharon, once so proud and domineering, stumbled toward me, her arrogance replaced by desperation. She reached out, her hands shaking as she tried to grasp mine. Evelyn. Please, she begged, her voice trembling. We didn't know. We didn't know anything. He's still your husband. You can fix this. You have the money, just pay the debt, make this all go away. I pulled my hand back before she could touch me, my gaze unwavering as I met her tear-filled eyes. No, I said simply. The single word carried more weight than anything I had ever said before. You told me for 5 years that I was nothing. That I lived off your son. That I didn't belong in this family. I took a step back, putting distance between us. Now you can live with the truth. Her face crumpled, the realization hitting her harder than any insult ever could. Everything she had believed in, everything she had built her pride upon was gone, and there was nothing she could do to bring it back. As the police escorted Ethan and Chloe out of the ballroom past the silent watching crowd, the final chapter of their illusion came to an end. The once powerful CEO was now nothing more than a disgraced criminal, his reputation destroyed beyond repair. The guests began to disperse slowly, their whispers filled with shock, judgment, and disbelief. The grand celebration had turned into something else entirely, a public downfall, a spectacle no one would ever forget. And through it all, I remained standing calm and composed, watching it unfold with a sense of closure I had never thought possible. The house, the company, my name, everything that had always been mine was finally back in my hands. But more importantly, so was my dignity. The weight I had carried for 5 years lifted in that moment, leaving behind something lighter, stronger. I was no longer the woman who endured in silence. I was no longer the shadow behind someone else's success. I was Evelyn Hayes, and for the first time in a very long time, I was free. 1 year later, the life I once thought had been shattered beyond repair had transformed into something stronger, clearer, and entirely my own. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, casting a warm glow over the city below, a city that now felt different, no longer heavy with memories of humiliation but filled with quiet opportunity. I stood there in silence for a moment, holding a cup of tea, taking in the view not as someone who had lost everything, but as someone who had finally reclaimed it. Hayes Industries was thriving under my direct leadership, stronger than it had ever been before. The chaos Ethan had left behind had been methodically repaired, every stolen asset recovered, every corrupted account cleansed, every weakness reinforced. The board trusted me, the employees respected me, and for the first time my name stood openly at the top where it had always belonged. There was no more hiding. No more shrinking to protect someone else's pride. I was no longer a shadow, I was the foundation. As for Ethan, his fate had unfolded exactly as it should have. His crimes had been undeniable, his fall swift and absolute. He was now serving a long sentence, his once carefully crafted image reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered in business circles. Chloe had followed the same path, her ambition collapsing into disgrace, her name permanently tied to the scandal that had exposed them both. Their future, once built on stolen dreams, had dissolved into consequences they could no longer escape. Sharon and Jessica, stripped of the luxury they had once taken for granted, had been forced to face a reality they had never imagined. Without the illusion of wealth to shield them, they were left to rebuild their lives from nothing, burdened by the very consequences they had helped create. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, but I felt no pity either. It was simply the natural result of the choices they had made. As I set my cup down and turned back toward my desk, a quiet sense of peace settled within me. The past no longer held power over me. The pain, the betrayal, the years of silence, they had all shaped me, but they no longer defined me. I had lost an illusion, but in its place I had found something far more valuable, myself. And as I walked forward into the future, there was only one truth that mattered: I was no longer surviving. I was living fully and unapologetically in a life that was finally mine.